I watched Marcus lift the delicate porcelain cup to his lips, steam curling around his face like incense at a funeral. His funeral, if everything went according to plan. The morning light streaming through our kitchen windows caught the amber liquid perfectly, illuminating tiny particles that danced in the Earl Grey like microscopic dancers performing their final waltz. Perfect as always, darling, he murmured, those same lips that had whispered lies for 3 years now, curved in the smile that once made my heart race. Now it only made my pulse quicken with anticipation. You know exactly how I like it. Oh, I know exactly how you like it, Marcus. The same way you liked serving me my morning coffee for months, with just a whisper of something extra. Something that took my hair first, strand by silken strand, then my energy, then my will to live, and finally, my life itself. His mother, Patricia, glanced up from her own cup across our mahogany dining table, the one we'd bought together during our first year of marriage when I still believed in fairy tales. Elena makes the most wonderful tea. You're so lucky to have such a devoted wife, Marcus. She dabbed her lips with the linen napkin I'd embroidered with her initials last Christmas, back when I'd still been trying to win her approval. I do hope you appreciate what a treasure you have. The luckiest man alive, Marcus agreed, taking another long, deliberate sip. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed, and I felt a dark satisfaction watching that simple movement. Each swallow brought him closer to understanding what I'd endured. Each drop of liquid sliding down his throat carried him toward the justice he'd denied me. Not for much longer, my love. Not for much longer. I smiled back at them both, the perfect picture of the doting wife in my soft pink cashmere sweater and pearl earrings, the same outfit I'd worn to my own funeral in another life. My hands were steady as I lifted my own cup to my lips. Earl Grey, just Earl Grey. I wasn't stupid enough to poison myself twice. But theirs? Theirs contained something special. Something I'd learned about in my previous life, during those final desperate weeks when I'd grown suspicious and started researching my symptoms online in the dark hours before dawn. Ricin, odorless, tasteless, and absolutely devastating when administered in carefully calculated doses over time. Just like what they'd done to me, only more efficient, more final. The irony was delicious. How are you feeling today, dear? Patricia asked, her voice dripping with the false concern I now recognized for what it was. You mentioned yesterday that you'd been having those headaches again. Much better, actually, I replied, letting my voice carry just the right note of grateful relief. I think Marcus's suggestion about cutting back on caffeine was exactly right. I've been sleeping so much better since I switched to tea in the mornings. Marcus's eyes flickered with something. Pride? Satisfaction? In my first life, I'd interpreted that expression as love. Now I knew it was the look of a predator pleased with his prey's compliance. He'd been so clever, suggesting the switch from coffee to tea. It had made the transition easier when he'd started his campaign of slow murder, switching from arsenic in my coffee to the more sophisticated approach he'd eventually settled on. Sleep is so important for a woman's constitution, Patricia agreed, sipping delicately from her cup. My Marcus has always been so thoughtful about these things. Even as a little boy, he was always looking out for others. Looking out for others. The words made my stomach turn, but I kept my expression serene. Looking out for others. Like when he'd looked out for his ex-girlfriend, Sarah, by planning my murder so he could marry her and claim my life insurance. Like when he'd looked out for his sister, Rachel, by promising her a cut of the money. Like when he'd looked out for his dear mother by ensuring she'd have a front row seat to watch me die slowly, all while maintaining plausible deniability. They'd all watched, they'd all known, they'd all participated in their own special ways, but that was in my first life. This time, things would be different. This time, I held all the cards. The first time I died, it was on a Tuesday morning in October. I remember because the trees outside my hospital window were ablaze with autumn colors, and I'd thought what a beautiful day it was to leave the world. Marcus held my hand as I slipped away, tears streaming down his face. The grieving husband who'd watched helplessly as his beloved wife succumbed to a mysterious illness that had baffled doctors for months. The irony wasn't lost on me even as my consciousness faded. I was dying on the most beautiful day I'd seen in months, and the last face I saw was that of my murderer, performing grief like he was auditioning for an Academy Award. The doctors never figured it out. Arsenic is clever that way, mimicking so many other conditions. Chronic fatigue, digestive issues, hair loss, neurological problems. Each symptom could be explained away individually and taken together. They painted a picture of a young woman with a mysterious autoimmune condition that had simply proven too aggressive to treat. But I knew. In those final moments, when the veil between life and death grew thin and my mind became crystal clear for the first time in months, everything crystallized with horrible, perfect clarity. The way he'd always insisted on making my coffee, measuring out the cream and sugar with scientific precision. The way his insurance agent had visited more frequently, always when I was too tired to participate in the conversation. The way his ex-girlfriend Sarah had started showing up at company events again, touching his arm just a little too familiarly, her eyes holding a promise of things to come. The way his mother and sister had discouraged me from seeking second opinions, suggesting I was being dramatic about my health concerns, that I was probably just stressed from trying to conceive. The way they'd all been so helpful, so concerned, so perfectly positioned to watch me waste away while maintaining their innocence. I died, knowing I'd been murdered by the man who'd promised to love and cherish me in sickness and in health. I died knowing his family had not just watched it happen, but had actively participated in it. I died knowing that within 6 months of my funeral, he'd be married to Sarah, living in our house, spending my money, and probably laughing about how easy it had all been. I died angry, and then, impossibly, I woke up. Not in heaven, not in hell, but in my own bed 18 months earlier. Marcus's arm draped over my waist like a shackle. The date on my phone read March 15th, exactly 1 month before he'd started his campaign to kill me. 1 month before my hair would start falling out in clumps. Before my energy would drain away like water through a sieve. Before I'd begin the slow spiral toward my death. The sheets were the same Egyptian cotton ones I'd picked out for our first anniversary. The morning light was filtering through the same cream-colored curtains I'd hung with such hope and excitement. Marcus was breathing the same steady rhythm against my neck that had once comforted me and later learned to despise. Everything was exactly as it had been, except for me. At first, I thought it was a nightmare born from the medications they'd pumped into me during those final weeks. Then I thought I was going insane, that my brain had finally snapped under the weight of betrayal and was creating elaborate fantasies to protect itself. But as the days passed and every detail unfolded exactly as I remembered, Marcus's morning routine of exactly 17 minutes in the bathroom, the weather patterns that had seemed so random the first time, even our neighbor's dog getting loose and destroying our mailbox on that specific Thursday, I had to accept the impossible. I'd been given a second chance. The question that haunted me as I lay in bed that first night, listening to my would-be murderer sleep peacefully beside me, was simple. What would I do with it? I'd spent my first life being the perfect wife, cooking his favorite meals with the enthusiasm of a newlywed, managing his social calendar like a professional assistant, supporting his career advancement while quietly sacrificing my own ambitions. I'd been so desperately, blindly in love that I'd ignored every red flag, explained away every cruel comment from his family, made myself smaller and smaller until I was barely a shadow of the woman I'd once been. I'd been the victim once. I'd been trusting, naive, eager to please. This time would be different. This time, I would be the predator. The transformation didn't happen overnight. For the first few weeks after my impossible resurrection, I played my part exactly as I had before, terrified that any deviation from the script might somehow unravel whatever cosmic accident had given me this opportunity for revenge. I woke up each morning at 6:30, just as I always had. I made Marcus his coffee, regular coffee, no additives yet, and prepared his breakfast of steel-cut oats with fresh berries and a drizzle of honey. I asked about his day, kissed him goodbye at the door, and spent my time managing our household with the efficiency of a Swiss timepiece. But now I watched everything with new eyes. I noticed how Marcus's phone buzzed with messages at odd hours. Messages he was quick to dismiss as work emergencies that required him to step into another room to handle. I noticed how he'd started working late more frequently, coming home with the scent of unfamiliar perfume clinging to his clothes, Sarah's perfume, I realized, though I'd never met her at this point in our timeline. I noticed how Patricia made subtle digs about my appearance, my cooking, my failure to provide her precious son with children yet. Comments that in my first life I'd dismissed as typical mother in law anxiety now revealed themselves for what they truly were: a deliberate campaign to erode my self confidence and isolate me from support systems. I noticed how Rachel, Marcus's sister, had begun asking pointed questions about our finances, our insurance policies, our plans for the future. Questions that seemed caring and familial on the surface, but carried an undercurrent of calculation that made my skin crawl. Most importantly, I noticed the exact date when Marcus's behavior shifted from merely neglectful to actively predatory. April 15th, tax day. The day our accountant had confirmed that my inheritance from my grandmother, the inheritance I'd never told Marcus's family about, had been properly invested and was now worth considerably more than the $2 million it had been when I'd received it. That was the night Marcus had first suggested we increase our life insurance policies. The morning after my rebirth revelation, I'd watched Marcus prepare my coffee with new eyes. He'd been so careful, so loving in his movements, measuring out the cream and sugar just how I liked it. I'd seen him slip into the pantry for just a moment, so quick I'd barely noticed the first time around. But now I knew what he was doing in there. The arsenic was hidden behind the flour in a small amber bottle labeled vitamin B complex. Clever. If anyone ever found it, it would look like health supplements, the kind of thing a loving husband might slip into his wife's coffee to help her with her chronic fatigue. I'd discovered his journal, too, hidden in his office safe. The combination was our anniversary date. How romantic. Page after page of careful documentation written in his precise handwriting. The amounts, the timing, my reactions. He'd recorded my decline like a scientist studying a lab rat, noting which doses produced which symptoms, adjusting his approach based on my body's responses. Day 1. Initial dose administered. 0.5 milligrams in morning coffee. No immediate reaction observed. Day 12. Elena complained of mild digestive issues. Reduced dose to 0.3 milligrams. Must maintain plausible deniability. Day 23. Elena complained of headaches again. Increased dose to 0.4 milligrams. Sweet spot seems to be around this level. She mentioned the headaches to Patricia, who suggested it might be stress. Good cover. Day 45. Hair loss becoming noticeable. Elena scheduled doctor's appointment for next week. Considering temporary suspension, don't want to move too quickly. Day 67. Doctor found nothing conclusive. Elena relieved but still concerned. Insurance policy now fully vested. Perhaps time to increase frequency rather than dose. Day 89. Elena collapsed during dinner party. Excellent cover. Everyone witnessed it. Patricia called ambulance. Doctor attributed it to dehydration and stress. Elena completely trusting of my care during recovery. Consider this approach for final phase. He'd planned it all, every symptom, every doctor's visit, every tearful night when I'd collapsed in his arms, convinced I was losing my mind. He'd held me while I cried about feeling crazy, all while knowing exactly why I felt that way. But he'd made one crucial mistake in his meticulous planning. He'd underestimated me. Marcus had fallen in love with a naive, trusting woman who believed the best of everyone and never questioned the motives of those she loved. He'd planned to murder that woman, and he'd succeeded. But that woman was gone now, replaced by someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous. Someone who had nothing left to lose. For 3 months, I played the part of the unsuspecting wife while I prepared my counterattack. I researched poisons with the dedication of a graduate student, studying absorption rates, detection methods, and symptom progressions. I studied Marcus's patterns like a behavioral analyst, noting every habit, every routine, every vulnerability. And slowly, carefully, I began gathering evidence of his crimes. The journal was the crown jewel, but it wasn't enough on its own. I needed a paper trail that would stand up in court, that would paint an undeniable picture of premeditated murder. I installed keyloggers on his computer and hidden cameras in his office. I photographed bank records that showed unusual cash withdrawals. I recorded phone conversations between him and Sarah. Conversations that revealed not just their affair, but their detailed discussions about my murder and their plans for afterward. Once Elena's gone, we can finally be together properly, Sarah had purred during one particularly illuminating call. Your mother was right. The insurance money will set us up perfectly. We could travel, buy that house in Tuscany we talked about. Patricia's been invaluable through all this, Marcus had replied. She's the one who suggested making it look like an autoimmune condition. Brilliant woman, my mother. And Rachel's connections at the insurance company have been incredibly helpful. So it wasn't just Marcus. It wasn't even just Marcus and Sarah. It was a family conspiracy with each member playing their assigned role in my destruction. Patricia provided medical cover, suggesting plausible explanations for my symptoms and discouraging me from seeking second opinions. Rachel used her position as an insurance investigator to ensure my policies were structured to pay out quickly and without extensive investigation. Marcus administered the poison and played the devoted husband. Sarah waited in the wings, ready to step into my life the moment my body was in the ground. They'd thought of everything. Everything except the possibility that their victim might come back from the dead with a burning desire for revenge. But I didn't want to simply expose them. I didn't want to hand them over to the police and trust in a justice system that might find reasonable doubt, might accept their tearful denials, might sentence them to a few years in comfortable prisons before releasing them to live the rest of their lives in freedom. I wanted them to suffer the way they'd made me suffer. I wanted them to feel their strength drain away day by day, to lose their hair, to lie awake at night wondering what was wrong with them. I wanted them to experience the helplessness, the fear, the slow realization that death was coming and there was nothing they could do to stop it. I wanted justice, and I wanted it served in a teacup. Ricin was perfect for my purposes. Unlike arsenic, it couldn't be detected in routine blood work, and its symptoms would be attributed to the flu, food poisoning, or general illness. The beautiful thing about ricin was that it could be made from castor beans, which I could order online as decorative plants for our garden. Patricia had even complimented me on the lovely new additions to our landscaping when she'd visited the previous weekend. Such beautiful plants, dear, she'd said, stroking the broad leaves with her manicured fingers. They'll look lovely once they're fully established. If only you knew, Patricia. If only you knew. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Every morning I would brew Marcus's favorite tea, Earl Grey with a dash of honey and cream. Patricia often joined us for breakfast during her weekly visits, and his sister Rachel frequently stopped by on her way to work. Perfect. They'd all watched me die. They could all share his fate. But I needed to be smarter than Marcus had been. No journals, no documentation that could be used against me. No digital footprints. No patterns that might raise suspicion. And most importantly, I needed an exit strategy that would leave me not just free but thriving. I'd learned from the best after all. I'd learned from my own murderer. I've been thinking about visiting my sister in Portland, I mentioned casually one morning as Marcus savored his poisoned tea. We were 1 week into my campaign, and he'd started complaining of mild stomach upset and occasional nausea, just like I had during those first few days of my own poisoning. Portland? Patricia raised an eyebrow, her cup halfway to her lips. The morning light caught the diamond tennis bracelet Marcus had given her for her last birthday, paid for with money from the investment account he'd been slowly draining in preparation for my murder. That's quite sudden, dear. You've never mentioned wanting to visit Sarah before. Sarah, my fictional sister, a creation I'd crafted during my months of preparation. These people knew so little about my actual family. I'd been estranged from my real relatives since college, a isolation they'd actively encouraged, that I could invent entire relationships without them questioning the details. Sarah and I have been talking more lately, I lied smoothly, letting a note of melancholy creep into my voice. She's been going through a rough divorce, and I thought a visit might help us both. I could use a change of scenery, especially with everything that's been going on. Marcus's hand stilled on his cup, and I saw the wheels turning in his mind. If I left town, his timeline would be disrupted. He'd been so careful about the pacing in my first life, building up to my death gradually to avoid suspicion. My sudden absence would throw off his calculations. Everything that's been going on? Rachel asked sharply. She'd arrived just minutes before, looking slightly disheveled in her business suit. The ricin was starting to affect her sleep patterns, making her irritable and unfocused. What do you mean? Oh, just life in general, I said with a vague wave of my hand. Work stress, family responsibilities. You know how it is. Sometimes a woman needs time away to recharge her batteries. How long were you thinking? Marcus asked, his voice carefully neutral. But I could see the panic in his eyes, the way his jaw tensed when he was trying to control his emotions. Maybe a month, two at most. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand, letting my fingers linger on his skin. He felt clammy, slightly feverish. The poison was working faster than I'd expected. I'll miss you terribly, of course, but I think some time apart might be good for us. Help us appreciate each other more. The panic in his eyes intensified. He couldn't object too strongly without seeming suspicious, but he also couldn't let me slip away when he was so committed to his plan. In my first life, he'd been confident in his control over me, secure in the knowledge that I was isolated and dependent on him. The idea that I might take independent action had never occurred to him. A month is quite a long time, Patricia said, ever the loyal mother-in-law. Her voice carried a note of authority that had once intimidated me but now simply amused me. Surely a week would be sufficient for whatever sisterly bonding you feel you need? Oh, but Patricia, I smiled sweetly, letting just a hint of steel creep into my voice. You've always said how important family is. And with Marcus working such long hours lately, I have so much time on my hands. I've been feeling quite unwell lately. Tired, listless. A change of scene might be just what I need. Marcus's face went pale at my words. He'd heard these exact complaints before in our first timeline. I was following my original script perfectly, and it was driving him crazy. He'd expected me to be dead or dying by now, not planning vacations and asserting independence. Actually, he said quickly, his voice higher than usual, maybe Portland is a wonderful idea. You should definitely go, soon. As soon as possible, really. Too late, darling. Far too late. Rachel and Patricia exchanged glances, a silent communication that I'd learned to read during my months of observation. They were concerned about the deviation from their plan, uncertain about how to proceed. In my first life, I'd been too focused on my own suffering to notice these small signals. Now I saw everything. Well, Patricia said finally, setting down her cup with a sharp clink, if you're determined to go gallivanting across the country, I suppose we can't stop you. Though I do think it's rather irresponsible to abandon your husband when he's clearly not feeling well. I'm fine, Mother, Marcus said automatically, though his voice was strained. Just tired from work. Of course you are, dear. I stood and began clearing the breakfast dishes, the picture of domestic efficiency. Which is exactly why some time apart will be good for both of us. You can focus on your health. Maybe see Dr. Henderson about that stomach bug you've been fighting. And I can have some quality time with Sarah. As I moved around the kitchen, I could feel their eyes following me, could sense the tension radiating from their little circle of conspirators. They were losing control of their narrative, and they didn't know how to regain it without revealing their true motives. Perfect. That afternoon, while Marcus was at work and his family had returned to their respective homes, I made my final preparations. Over the past several months, I'd been slowly moving money from our joint accounts to a private account Marcus didn't know about. Not enough to trigger alerts or raise suspicions, just small amounts transferred during what appeared to be routine shopping trips or charitable donations. I'd also been researching my legal options with the thoroughness of someone whose life depended on it, which in a very real sense it did. My lawyer, Janet Morrison, had been stunned when I'd first approached her with my situation. I'd presented it as a hypothetical case study, a friend who suspected her husband of planning her murder but needed to gather evidence before making any accusations. Elena, Janet had said, her usually composed demeanor cracking. If this friend of yours has evidence of attempted murder, she needs to call the police immediately. This isn't something to handle through divorce proceedings. But what if she wanted to ensure he faced consequences for all his crimes? I'd pressed. What if there were financial irregularities, insurance fraud, conspiracy charges that might be overlooked in a simple attempted murder case? Janet had leaned back in her leather chair, studying me with sharp eyes. Your friend sounds like someone who wants comprehensive justice rather than quick resolution. Exactly. And this hypothetical husband, he has family involved in the conspiracy? His mother, his sister. Possibly others. Janet had been quiet for a long moment, drumming her manicured nails against her desk. Finally, she'd leaned forward with something that looked almost like admiration in her eyes. Your friend sounds like a very intelligent woman who's been underestimated by some very dangerous people. She has been, and she wants to make sure they all face consequences. She does. Then your friend should know that justice comes in many forms. Sometimes the legal system provides it. Sometimes it has to be supplemented. Now, months later, everything was in place, divorce papers ready to be filed, evidence packages prepared for law enforcement, media outlets, and insurance investigators. Financial records documenting every fraudulent transaction, every suspicious policy change, every penny they'd stolen or planned to steal. But most importantly, I had Marcus's journal and the recordings of his family's conversations. Evidence that would not only destroy their freedom, but their reputations, their relationships, their very identities as respectable people. I'd learned that there were fates worse than death, and I was prepared to deliver them all. I woke before dawn the next morning, as I had every day for the past week. Marcus was still sleeping, but he'd been restless lately, tossing and turning as his body began to rebel against the poison coursing through his system. His breathing was labored, and his skin had a grayish pallor that spoke of internal systems beginning to fail. In the kitchen, I began the morning ritual that had become my meditation. Earl Grey tea, steeped for exactly 4 minutes in the bone china service that had been Patricia's wedding gift to us. A teaspoon of honey from the local farmer's market, a splash of organic cream, and just a tiny addition of my own special blend. The ricin was undetectable once dissolved into the honey, becoming part of the amber sweetness that Marcus had always loved. I'd been careful with the dosing, following my own modified version of his meticulous approach. Unlike Marcus, I didn't want to drag this out for months. 2 weeks of escalating symptoms, then a final dramatic dose that would finish the job. Quick enough to avoid extensive investigation, slow enough to make him suffer appropriately. Marcus stumbled into the kitchen earlier than usual, looking worse than I'd ever seen him. His usually perfect hair was disheveled and noticeably thinner. His skin had a waxy quality, and his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his cup. "Morning, sweetheart," I said brightly, handing him his final cup of tea. "You look tired. Maybe you should stay home today. Take a sick day?" He accepted the tea gratefully, already lifting it toward his lips with the desperation of an addict. "I can't. Too much going on at the office. Sarah's handling the Morrison account and—" He caught himself, his eyes widening as he realized what he'd said. "Sarah?" I asked innocently. "I don't think you've mentioned her before. New employee?" "Consultant," he said quickly, taking a large gulp of tea to cover his confusion. "Just helping with some temporary projects." Temporary projects, like murdering me and taking my place. I smiled and sipped my own untainted Earl Grey, savoring both the bergamot and the taste of approaching victory. The doorbell rang, and I heard Patricia's voice calling from the front hall. "Yo-hoo! It's just me!" She bustled into the kitchen with her usual energy, though I noticed she looked wan and shaky. Her usual perfect makeup couldn't quite hide the dark circles under her eyes or the slight tremor in her hands. Interesting, she must have been drinking more of the tea than I'd realized, perhaps taking some home with her in the thermos I'd thoughtfully provided. "Good morning, dear," she said, accepting her own cup with hands that weren't quite steady. "Marcus, you look absolutely dreadful. Are you ill?" "Just tired, Mother." But even his voice was weaker now, lacking the confident authority that had once commanded every room he entered. "Perhaps you should see Dr. Henderson," Patricia suggested, though her own voice was strained. "This has gone on long enough." Rachel arrived 10 minutes later, looking terrible. Her usually immaculate business attire was wrinkled, her hair was unwashed, and she was holding her stomach as if she were fighting nausea. When I offered her tea, she accepted it with shaking hands. "I feel like I'm dying," she said, and laughed weakly at her own words. "This flu just won't quit." "Not the flu, dear Rachel. Something much more permanent." "Maybe we should all see Dr. Henderson," Patricia said again, her voice carrying a note of real concern now. "We can't all be coming down with the same thing, can we?" "Food poisoning, maybe," I suggested helpfully, "or a stomach bug going around the office. These things can be very contagious." Marcus was staring at his teacup with an expression I couldn't quite read. For a moment, I wondered if he was finally starting to suspect something. But then, he drained the cup completely and set it down with a shaking hand. "Elena," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something." My heart raced. Was he about to confess? Had he figured out what was happening? Had my plan been too obvious? "Of course, darling, what is it?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with tears that might have been genuine if I hadn't known better. "I think I'm dying." How dramatic, Marcus. How wonderfully, perfectly dramatic. "Don't be silly," I said, sitting beside him and taking his clammy hand in mine. "You have the flu, nothing more. You'll be better in a few days." "No, Elena, this is different. I can feel it. Something's wrong. Really wrong." He squeezed my hand desperately, and I could feel how much weight he'd lost, how weak he'd become. "There are things I need to tell you. Things I should have said before." "Marcus, you're scaring me." "Promise me something," he interrupted, his voice urgent. "If anything happens to me, if I don't make it through this—" "Nothing's going to happen to you," I lied smoothly. "Promise me you'll be okay. Promise me you'll find someone who loves you the way you deserve to be loved. Someone better than me." The irony was suffocating. Here he sat, begging me to find love after he'd planned to murder me for insurance money and another woman. The audacity was breathtaking, but it was also oddly satisfying. He was finally acknowledging, in his own twisted way, that he didn't deserve me. "Nothing's going to happen to you," I repeated, "but I promise. If the worst should happen, I'll try to move on. I'll try to find happiness again." He pulled me close, holding me tight against his chest. I could feel how fragile he'd become, how the poison had eaten away at his strength, just as the arsenic had eaten away at mine. Soon, very soon, this would all be over. "I love you so much, Elena. You're the best thing that ever happened to me. I'm sorry for everything, for not being the husband you deserved." "You're right about that, Marcus. You're absolutely right." But instead of speaking those words aloud, I held him and murmured comforting lies into his ear. After all, mercy was a luxury I could afford now that justice was finally within reach. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, as if the weather itself was mourning what was about to unfold. Marcus could barely stand, and I had to help him to the kitchen table where Patricia and Rachel were already waiting. Both women looked terrible. Patricia's usually perfect appearance was disheveled, and Rachel had dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights spent fighting nausea and pain. "I think we all need to go to the hospital," Patricia said weakly, her voice lacking its usual commanding tone. "This isn't normal. We can't all have the same flu." "You're probably right," I agreed, moving to the stove where the kettle was already whistling. "Let me just make some tea for strength. Then we'll call Dr. Henderson." I prepared their final cups with extra care, adding twice the usual amount of rice into each one. This would be their last morning, their last cup of tea, their last breath in my presence. The irony wasn't lost on me that they would die drinking the same beverage I'd served them with love for 3 years. As I handed Marcus his cup, our eyes met. For just a moment, I saw something flicker across his face, a flash of recognition, of understanding. His eyes dropped to the cup, then back to my face, and I saw the exact moment when realization dawned. "Elena," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "what have you done?" I smiled at him, the same serene smile I'd worn through months of his slow murder campaign. "I've given you exactly what you gave me, my love. No more, no less." He stared at the cup in his hands, understanding finally flooding his features. "You know." "I've always known. I died knowing." I sat across from him, sipping my own innocent tea while watching his world crumble. "The question is, are you going to drink it?" Patricia and Rachel were still too ill to follow our whispered conversation, but Marcus understood perfectly. He could refuse the tea, could throw it away, could run to the hospital right now and possibly save himself. But doing so would mean admitting that he knew the tea was poisoned, which would raise questions about how he knew, which would lead to the discovery of his own murder plot. He was trapped by his own guilt. "Why?" he asked, though we both knew the answer. "Because you killed me, Marcus. Because your mother and sister helped you do it. Because you all stood around my deathbed and grieved so convincingly while planning how to spend my money. I leaned forward, lowering my voice to a whisper. Because justice demands balance. He lifted the cup to his lips with trembling hands and drank deeply. Patricia and Rachel followed suit, both too sick to notice the significance of our exchange. Within an hour, all three of them were violently ill. Marcus collapsed in the hallway, his body convulsing as the poison overwhelmed his systems. Patricia fell unconscious in the living room, her breathing becoming increasingly labored. Rachel made it to the bathroom before her body finally gave out completely. I called 911, screaming and crying into the phone with an anguish that was only partially feigned. After all, this was my family too, in its own twisted way. Please, you have to help. Something's wrong with my husband. They're all sick. They're dying. I don't know what happened. The hospital was chaos incarnate. 3 people from the same family, all presenting with identical symptoms: severe dehydration, organ failure, neurological damage. The medical staff was baffled by the sudden onset and aggressive progression of their illness. I played the part of the distraught wife perfectly, weeping in the waiting room while medical teams fought to save the lives of my would-be murderers. Nurses brought me coffee and tissues, murmuring comforting words about how these things sometimes happened, how medicine didn't have all the answers. Food poisoning can be devastating when it hits this hard, one kind nurse told me, but the doctors are doing everything they can. Food poisoning, if only you knew how accurate that assessment is. Dr. Harrison, the lead physician, approached me with the grave expression doctors reserve for delivering the worst possible news. His scrubs were stained with evidence of his efforts, and exhaustion lined his face. Mrs. Morrison, I need to prepare you for what we're facing. Your husband's condition is extremely serious. We're not entirely sure what caused this, but his organs are shutting down systematically. The next few hours will be critical. Is he going to die? I whispered, letting tears stream down my face. They were real tears. Tears of relief, of vindication, of grief for the innocent woman I'd once been. We're doing everything we can, he said gently, the same words doctors had said to Marcus when I was dying in my first life. But you should call any family members who might want to say goodbye. Family members, like his sister and mother, who are dying in the rooms next door. I nodded mutely and pulled out my phone, pretending to scroll through contacts while actually accessing the voice recorder I'd been using to document this final act. Every word, every moment needed to be preserved. After all, I was still telling a story, and every story needed a proper ending. Rachel went first, her body finally succumbing to the poison after 18 hours of agony. I was holding her hand when she died, whispering words of forgiveness that tasted like ashes in my mouth. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was showing her more mercy in death than she'd ever shown me in life. Patricia lasted another 6 hours, her strong constitution fighting the inevitable until the very end. Her final words were about Marcus, concern for her son that might have been touching if I hadn't known what she'd helped him do to me. Marcus, perhaps because he was stronger, or perhaps because fate wanted him to suffer longer, clung to life for nearly 2 days. I maintained my vigil by his bedside, playing the devoted wife until the final moment. The nurses praised my dedication, how I never left his side, how I kept talking to him even when he could no longer respond. If only they knew I was there to ensure he suffered every moment he'd planned for me to suffer. His final words were barely audible, whispered through lips that could barely form the sounds. Elena, I'm sorry, so sorry. I know you are, Marcus, I know you are. I held his hand as he died, feeling his pulse flutter and fade beneath my fingers. As his life left him, I felt something inside me settle into place. Not peace exactly, but a sense of completion. The circle was closed. The debt was paid. Justice had been served in a teacup. The investigation that followed was thorough, but ultimately inconclusive. The medical examiner found evidence of ricin poisoning, but couldn't determine the source. The prevailing theory was contaminated food at a restaurant they'd all visited recently, though no other patrons had fallen ill and the restaurant's inspection revealed no irregularities. I played the grieving widow beautifully, accepting condolences and casseroles from neighbors who remembered how devoted I'd been to my husband's family. Poor Elena, who'd lost her husband, sister-in-law, and mother-in-law all in one terrible weekend. Poor Elena, who now faced the world alone at such a young age. The insurance company paid out without question. $3 million from Marcus's policy, plus Patricia's modest life insurance, plus the substantial assets Marcus had accumulated during our marriage. Poor little Elena, now independently wealthy in her grief. I donated the tea set to charity. It seemed appropriate. During the investigation, I'd been careful to mention Marcus's recent stress, his complaints about stomach problems, his concerns about his health. I painted a picture of a man who'd been struggling with anxiety about his future, who'd been working too hard and not taking care of himself. When investigators found his journal hidden in the safe, which I'd anonymously tipped them off about, the truth came out with devastating completeness. Not just the planned murder, but the financial fraud, the conspiracy with his family, the affair with Sarah. The scandal consumed the local news for weeks. Sarah was arrested on conspiracy charges. The insurance company launched a full investigation that revealed Rachel's involvement and led to her posthumous disgrace. Even in death, the family that had planned my murder faced consequences for their crimes, but I wasn't finished yet. 6 months later, I was living in a penthouse overlooking San Francisco Bay, my new life finally beginning in earnest. I'd started a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting women escaping abusive relationships, using my personal experience and Marcus's blood money to fund counseling services, legal aid, and safe houses. The irony would have made Marcus laugh if he'd still been capable of laughter. My lawyer Janet joined me for dinner at an exclusive restaurant overlooking the bay. We'd become friends during the aftermath of my widowhood, bonded by our shared understanding of how justice really worked in the world. You know, she said over wine that cost more than most people made in a week, I still can't believe how well everything worked out for you after everything you went through. Sometimes justice finds a way, I replied, raising my glass to catch the last rays of sunset. Sometimes the universe balances the scales. Still, she mused, studying me with those sharp legal eyes, it's remarkable how they all got sick at the same time. What were the odds? I smiled serenely, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of crimson and gold. Sometimes life is stranger than fiction, Janet. Sometimes the guilty get exactly what they deserve. And sometimes, she said quietly, the victims get the justice the system couldn't provide. That night, alone in my beautiful new home with its panoramic views and perfect silence, I opened my laptop and began writing. A novel, I decided. A story about a woman who was murdered by her husband and given a second chance at life. A story about justice, revenge, and the power of knowledge. I titled it The Teacup Widow. The first chapter began. I watched Marcus lift the delicate porcelain cup to his lips, steam curling around his face like incense at a funeral. His funeral, if everything went according to plan. Fiction, of course, pure fiction. But as I wrote, I couldn't help but smile at the memory of that final morning, watching my murderers drink their last cups of tea. The looks on their faces when they realized something was terribly wrong. The way Marcus had stared at me in those final moments, understanding finally flickering in his dying eyes. I'd given them the same mercy they'd planned to give me, none at all. Outside my window, the city sparkled with 10 million lights, 10 million people living their lives, unaware that justice sometimes comes in a teacup, unaware that sometimes the victim gets to write the ending. I poured myself a cup of Earl Grey, just Earl Grey, nothing more, and continued writing. After all, I had a story to tell, a true story about love, betrayal, murder, and the revenge that followed. A story about what happens when the dead refuse to stay buried, and this time, I was the one in control of how it ended. The universe had given me a second chance, and I'd made the most of it. Marcus and his family had planned to destroy me slowly, carefully, methodically. Instead, they'd created their own destruction. They'd taught me that mercy was a luxury I couldn't afford. They'd taught me that justice sometimes required getting your hands dirty. Most importantly, they'd taught me that poison was a dish best served hot in a delicate porcelain cup with just a touch of honey. I raised my teacup in a silent toast to my dead husband and his family, then returned to my writing. After all, I had a bestseller to finish, a foundation to run, and a life to live. The life they'd tried to steal from me was finally, truly mine. And somewhere in the distance, carried on the evening wind. I could almost hear Marcus screaming.